Hello again, it's Brad. I'm a bookseller here at University Bookstore, and I thought I'd make a few recommendations. Today, what I thought I'd be recommending was history. Now I know, for a lot of people, Cleo is the most boring of the muses, and I understand that. I'm a product of the American educational system too. If you're as old as I am, which is the end of the baby boom, I think we can all agree that the way history was taught had a great deal to do with why, perhaps now, we're not eager to read it, most of us. And that's because everybody knew the score by the time you got to high school. And everybody could hum the same tune because it didn't change. History in high school and before was, well, K through 12, was the same 4th of July concert every time. You knew where it started, with some variation on Yankee Doodle Dandy. You knew that it moved on to the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and then there was a stirring bit of John Philip Sousa, and perhaps, if you had a very young teacher, something as modern as Aaron Copland. But there were not a lot of dynamics. There was not a lot of color or variation. And everything seemed settled. The facts were settled. The opinions expressed about the facts were largely settled. And it was all about the inexorable march of American Republican democracy towards perfection. Now, I suspect that was meant to be reassuring. And it probably was. It probably was to me at the time. But one of the good things about being alive now is that the challenges to those rather boring and predictable arrangements of history, there have been a lot of new voices added. I'll abandon the metaphor, but you'd see what I mean. Suddenly there are all sorts of people telling those stories in very different ways, and very different stories from the ones we knew, and from the perspectives of lots of people that were not included. Now, these are all recent things that I wanted to bring to your attention, and in all of these cases, nearly, they tell pretty familiar stories. For instance, Julia Flavel has written a book called The Howe Dynasty, the untold story of a military family and the women behind Britain's wars for America. Now, you'll all remember this segment of the concert, as it were. The Howe brothers. One was an admiral, one was a general, and they were sort of in charge of responding to what we call the American Revolution. And one of the regrettable things about them, among many regrettable things about the British conduct of that war, is that we tend to know these two gents as the people who lost America. Not between them exclusively, but... And the British weren't entirely kind to them when they got home, but they nevertheless continued to have promotion and prominence and so on. So how is that possible? And one of the difficulties is that neither of them left a particularly extensive record behind them. Actually, they did. We just didn't know it. Why? Because the record that this historian is consulting is women's letters. The sisters of the brothers, Carolyn in particular. And it's a fascinating insight into the other war that was waged, the war for reputation and publicity that went on back home in Britain while the boys were away, and how the construction of power, I don't know that it's changed that much, was dependent not only on the actions, the things you did to make you famous, but the way they were interpreted by people who had money and power and influence, and how that's how you got yours, was through them. There's a whole network of women in this book, and they're all writing letters, Carolyn in particular. And the point of the letters is to promote the fame of the men. Frankly, because there's no other fame available. On June 17, 1775, almost 17 years since he and George Lord Howe had planned the attack on Ticonderoga as they lay on a bearskin looking at the stars, John Stark was shouting orders to colonial volunteers on the opposite side of the murderous rail fence. A story trickled back to the women of the Howe clan that the Americans had deliberately spared William as he stood alone before the barricade. I don't know if their avoiding him is true or not, but it's very moving if it is, pronounced Lady Sarah Banbury, who was horrified at the thought of a bloody conflict among our own people almost. She reflected the view of many when she called it so vile and fruitless a service where General Howe may be killed and cannot get any honor. Carolyn knew that in this war against ramshackle British colonists, William's hero status could not be taken for granted. She wrote in a self-conscious vein to Lady Spencer of General Howe's persistent popularity, though employed in a service so odious. In the coming years, Carolyn would be sure to broadcast in influential social spheres whatever news or intelligence enhanced her brother's reputation. As his sister, it was her duty. Fascinating women who, in their turn, make rather stultifying gentlemen interesting again. It's a really good book. It's from Liverite. The next book I wanted to mention is forthcoming. It's not even out yet. It's not out until November 9th, but make a note. November 9th from Atria Books. And this one is by Catherine Ostler, and it's called The Duchess Countess, the woman who scandalized 18th century London. It's a similar period, and in some ways a similar story, because it's the reclamation of a woman who features prominently in a lot of stories from the period, but who has not her own voice in almost any of those tellings. And so what the historian or biographer has done here is an attempt to restore the humanity to a fascinating character, a person, well, unlike any I've met before. Here's just a brief paragraph describing her. Duchess, countess, courtier, socialite, hostess, mariner, property developer, celebrity, vodka distiller, press manipulator, arts patron, bigamist. Elizabeth Chudleigh was the great anti-heroine of the Georgian era. Her story reads like a dark fairy tale, Cinderella gone hideously, publicly wrong, with all the force of a Hogarthian twist, with too many princes and glass slippers left smashed in her wake. The centerpiece of this book is a trial for bigamy. It's hard to tell the story without giving too much away. There are surprises, genuine surprises. I'd never heard of this, or if I had, it was probably peripheral. This woman turns out to have been one of the inspirations for Becky Sharp, Thackeray's great character, and a lot of other people in a lot of other books derive from the fame of this lady. She went many places, did many things, and made more than one marriage, as might be suggested by the subject. Fascinating. I recommend it highly. It reads like a long, wonderful Vanity Fair article set in the 18th century. Now, the next thing I wanted to mention takes us back considerably further, and that's a book by James Romm from Scribner, and it's called The Sacred Band. Now, you may have heard of the Sacred Band, 300 Theban lovers fighting to save Greek freedom. The Theban band features prominently in more than one ancient source. They tend to feature in a very particular way, so that if you were acquainted with them at all, it's usually from the perspective of one of two historians, one of whom very much preferred the other side in the fight described, and is very disdainful, and the other one who finds them admirable, Plutarch, but admirable as he finds, and Xenophon doesn't, they nevertheless, despite their enormous fame in the ancient world, don't have a lot of attention paid in the intervening centuries by, say, British or American scholars. And yet, a curious thing happens. At a certain point, couple of hundred years ago, somebody decides to find the Theban band where they fell. And he does. Thanks to a horse kicking up a bone, is how it starts. But anyway, the point of the dig is this gentleman, a German gentleman, actually excavates the site and even draws what he finds, the positions of the bodies, skeletons, and he pictures them all, including skeletons laying side by side, some of them holding hands. Well, that's not a story I know, not this way. The Theban band were a band of lovers, men and their lovers, who fought together for Thebes. And it's not the 300 that you know from comic books and movies. In fact, these are, in many ways, the exact opposite of Gerard, what's-his-name, running about shirtless in a short skirt, explaining the nobility of masculine company, free from the icky complications of sexual encounters. These were lovers that fought and died together, and that were much admired in the ancient world. And the nice thing about this modern book is that he doesn't bring a lot of Victorian hesitation to the subject. He accepts on face value who these men were, and he's curious about how their reputation gets interpreted by ancient historians as well as modern, and how, with the lifting of a certain fog of moral disapproval, we can see a lot more clearly, even than we did, say, 100 years ago, what it was the ancients admired. It's fascinating. It's quite brief. It's not a long book. It's only about 250 pages. And it's a very exciting story, told in a very exciting way. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention really isn't history at all. What it is a series from Princeton. Look at those. Ain't they pretty? And what these are well, anyway, it's a bunch of books from classical authors: Seneca, Suetonius, Thucydides, Cicero. And they're packaged and translated in a new way, a very contemporary way, Often, the Ciceros, for instance, by a fellow named Michael Fontaine. And what I like about them, other than the fact that they're pretty and affordable at $16.95 a pop, they do have the parallel text of either Latin or Greek. And they're, to use a word that people either like or don't, doesn't matter, they're accessible. So, instead of saying On Humor by Marcus Tullius Cicero, we have How to Tell a Joke, an ancient guide to the art of humor. And now, admittedly, with Cicero, whom I love, they're going to be dad jokes, lawyer jokes, that sort of thing. And quite often they're at the expense of other people that we won't know. But it doesn't matter when you say something like, that guy has it all except money and redeeming qualities. That's not bad, is it? It's good that that survived as long as it has. Here's a sort of lawyer joke from the same volume. On the other hand, there really is a sterling example of that type. He's talking about the types of humor, and he's talking about comebacks and quips. In order to prove he ambushed Clodius, the prosecutor alleged that Milo had stopped off at Beauvillé to wait for Clodius to leave his villa, and before 3 p.m. When he then kept asking over and over again, when was he killed, Milo replied, late. Thucydides, How to Think About War. Suetonius, How to Be a Bad Emperor. Clever title. Seneca, How to Keep Your Cool. I like the idea of Stoics teaching people to keep their cool. How to Give. Plutarch, How to Be a Leader. That was the fellow who talked about the band. I love this. How to Drink, a classical guide to imbibing. Anyway, you get the point. They're pretty little things. They are historically legitimate. They contain the original text and the translation, facing pages, which is good. And they're just a marvelous way in. If you haven't read Cicero or Thucydides, here's a chance to do it in an amusing and light way and still get the benefit of meeting some of the great personalities of the ancient world. Princeton. Anyway, there we are. I hope you'll pick up one or more of the things I recommend and try history. The tune has changed. Let's just say they've allowed in a certain Samuel Barber quality. Anyway, that's all. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.